He eventually escaped. Then, after the war, he was imprisoned a second time for helping to plot the assassination of a pro-British Egyptian aristocrat. He was held in cell 54 of Cairo's central prison, a cell much like this one. Sadat says the 18 months he spent there changed his life.
This has formed my inner resistance, really, because I overcame this. The last 6 months, they were the most happiest time that I lived or will ever live. Why? In two places you shall always find yourself, your real self. Number one is prison, number two is war.
Cell 54 became Sadat's university. During his time in prison, he taught himself English and read everything he could get his hands on.
He had an incredible appetite for reading thereafter, and that gave him some significant advantages because he was an educated man, if you will, and he did know what other people thought by having read their books.
After his release from prison, Sadat was expelled from the army and eked out a living working first for a contracting business, then as a driver and a journalist. During those years, Sadat divorced his first wife, a girl from his village, and in 1949 married a lively 16-year-old beauty named Jihan Roof. Her mother was English, her father an Egyptian doctor. They would raise 6 children, including 2 girls by his previous marriage.
10 years ago, 15 years ago, did you think that Anwar al-Sadat was going to be this extraordinary figure upon the world stage?
When I married my husband, there was a fortune teller who told me that you will become the first lady in this country. And of course I laughed. I was surprised. I don't think I imagined one day that I will be the first or my husband will be the first. But always I had the feeling in my back mind that there will be the time that we are going to do something for our country.
Sadat's rise to the presidency began in 1951, when he won reinstatement in the army and renewed contact with Nasser. Together, the two began plotting a military coup against King Farouk.
They saw Farouk as a tool of the colonial powers, but they had good reason to think so. They saw him as corrupt.
Nasser launched his coup on July 23, 1952. Sadat broke the news to the Egyptian people over Cairo radio. And a short while later, King Farouk agreed to leave the country. As president, Nasser embraced socialism, redistributing land to the poor and nationalizing foreign-owned industries, including the Suez Canal, run jointly by the French and British. He was a strong, autocratic leader who championed Arab unity and became the de facto leader of the Arab world.
Nasser provided the pride that Egypt needed to restore its place in the Arab world, to restore its reputation. He was a leader of all Arabs.
During the Nasser years, Sadat held various positions, from editor of the government newspaper to speaker of the Egyptian parliament. Nasser distrusted his subordinates, so Sadat was careful to keep a low profile. Critics say he was weak. They called him Nasser's poodle. Sadat says he disagreed with Nasser at times, but did so in private.
Whenever one starts to criticize him openly, he loses his temper completely. I know this because he was my friend since we were 19. So whenever there were anything to criticize, I used to do this between me and him, either at his home or in my home, but not openly.
In December 1969, Nasser rewarded Sadat's loyalty by appointing him vice president.
Nasser appointed several vice presidents in his career, and it was a roulette game. People were appointed vice presidents, they were dismissed as vice president, so it was really the luck of the draw, if you will.
On September 28, 1970, Nasser died of a heart attack, and millions of Egyptians turned out to mourn. The fortune teller's prophecy many years earlier had come true. Anwar Sadat became president of Egypt, and Jehan Sadat his first lady. It was the fall of 1970. Jamal Abdel Nasser had just died, and his vice president, Anwar Sadat, had become president. Sadat's political rivals were stunned at the unexpected turn of events.
Sadat was viewed as a lightweight. Nasser had given him very little responsibility during the time he was vice president, and so people were not expecting much.
Sadat's opponents immediately began plotting his overthrow, but the plotters underestimated Sadat. He outwitted them, and 8 months after taking office, had them all jailed. When Sadat finally began the hard work of governing, he was shocked to discover that Nasser's socialist policies and his disastrous 1967 war with Israel had bankrupted the country. The war had lasted just 6 days. On the first day, Israel destroyed 3/4 of Egypt's aircraft. After that, it crushed the armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and seized large swaths of their land, including Egypt's Sinai Desert.
You had Egypt lose one of its key sources of income, and that is the Suez Canal.
Replenishing equipment lost in the war cost billions of dollars. A year-long war of attrition fought across the Suez Canal beginning in 1969 cost billions more.
You had cities across the Suez Canal that were devastated, with hundreds of thousands of people moving into Cairo, which became a very overcrowded city.
To address the country's problems, Sadat began cautiously turning away from the disastrous policies of his predecessor. He allowed political parties to form and returned private property seized under Nasser. For Sadat, the move towards greater democracy was a risky course. He was never the beloved leader that Nasser was, and the opponents of change were becoming more vocal. What's more, Sadat's fondness for the trappings of power distanced him from the common man.
Sadat was a very proud man. He had gone from nothing to being the president of Egypt. He was probably one of the best dressed men in Egypt. He enjoyed the privileges of wealth.
He had the riding crop under his arm. He was impeccably manicured and dressed. His uniforms were Hollywood style. His parades were sensational, Disney-like productions.
Sadat enjoyed media attention. He spoke fluent English and granted frequent interviews to the foreign press. He was a master at manipulating the press, so separating the person from the public image was always difficult.
Some people saw him as a new pharaoh or a new dictator, a new king. So he would go back to the village and try to show that he came from very humble origins, that his mother and father lived in this primitive town, and that he was still close to the soil.
Historians may disagree over who is the real Sadat, but there's no disagreement over his devotion to his country. Sadat was an ardent nationalist. To him, the presence of Israeli troops on Egyptian soil was a stain on the nation's honor.
It's just a very simple problem. Part of my land is occupied. This part of my land I want to be liberated by peaceful solution, or if it is not liberated by peaceful solution, it is my right and duty to liberate it.
To Sadat, the occupation of the Sinai and Egypt's economic problems were intertwined. If he could expel the Israelis, he could reopen the Suez Canal and reap the profits from Sinai oil fields developed by the Israelis. Sadat had tried negotiating through third parties to regain the Sinai, but had little patience for the hair-splitting involved in traditional diplomacy.
Sadat was just fed up with it all. He wanted to change the dice on the table. He wanted to break the impasse with a dramatic move.
He believed very profoundly, I think, that major events shift the psychological outlook, that shocks create a change in the environment in a way that opens up possibilities.
Sadat knew that nothing would create a greater shock than starting another war. He arrived at that conclusion, as he did most of his important decisions, alone and after hours of contemplation.
Well, I always find there is change with him when he is going to take such a very big decision. I notice it and I feel it immediately. And he takes a long time thinking and sitting alone, and then I can know what's going on.